Right, as Katie says in her interviews, we are now recording. Hello. So Katie, it's wonderful to have you here. For those who don't know, I'm Reverend Jody Rev. I'm a vicar in Harrow. I'm a shielding vicar, which with my household, and so I've done an interview with Katie before, and I'm also happen to be elected as clergy chair for the Diocese of London at the moment. So we'll let Katie introduce herself in a sec. But the reason that I wanted to do this interview is that I became really aware, very much in the first, I guess the first few weeks, the first month of lockdown, about questions surrounding what online church is, how much it is church, in fact, its validity and all those kind of questions. And I was really aware that those who had been engaging with online church for a long time, and particularly those who were disabled and part of that community, had been experiencing online church, had been doing it forever, and perhaps we should kind of have that conversation with people who knew what they were talking about. And so particularly for me, there were questions around accessibility, but also what it means to have worship done from the domestic space. So I was interested to talk to Katie because I thought she probably had quite a lot to say. So Katie, why don't you introduce yourself? Or lots of wisdom to give us. Yeah, so Katie, why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll ask you some of my questions.
Cool. Lots of words, maybe some wisdom tucked in there somewhere like an oyster. So I'm Katie Tupling. Before I got ordained, I was a youth and children's worker across Birmingham, so seeing lots of different sides of the economy of Birmingham and the outworking in different households. Then God finally won the argument and I got ordained. That was interesting in itself. That's a whole other interview. And I was ordained in 2003, so I did a curacy in Belpratside, Derby, which is great fun. Loved it. One of the few success stories of curacy that I hear. Learned a huge amount. Became an incumbent still in Derby Diocese in the north part, in the tourist part of Hathersage, Bamford and Grindleford. A bit like being the vicar of Dibley, only not quite as funny, but definitely as real. None of that's made up. It's a documentary, basically. But also learned a huge amount. Had my son in the middle of that, so I became a clergy mummy right in the middle of that incumbency, which is also a learning curve.
And I think probably the first time we met, actually, we met.
I think you're one of my founding members of Clergy Mummies, which has now just gone global.
So I think actually, I was thinking that our friendship, our relationship has, for the majority, been an online one. We have met occasionally in real.
Yes.
I don't want to say in real life because this is real life, but we have occasionally met in person, in the flesh, as it were.
We
but
have.
Mostly our
first met online.
Online, and hasn't been to the detriment of our friendship.
Absolutely. In fact, when I met you kind of in like physical space, I felt like I'd known you for years. I kind of rushed across and went, "Hello, Jody," and you're like, and I had my hair different from my Facebook picture. You're like, and you are. I'm like, look at the crutches, love. It's Katie. You went, oh, yes, the crutches. That's exactly who you are now. They're just snoozing down here behind the pots and pans. There you go. So, and then the second incumbency in Sheffield Diocese with two village-ish, but swamped by the urban church parishes there. Which was again another learning curve. Became a training incumbent to person succession, fantastic, and then came to the end of my love of incumbency. If there had been no love, certainly came to the end of incumbency, and wrote to my bishop and went, "I think I'm done. I need to find who I am away from the system of incumbency." Exploring lots about disability activism, online space over that previous sort of 5-10 years. And just resigned, kind of not on the spot, because I've been giving a lot of thought, but resigned October 2018. And a week after going public, the job I'm in now went public as an advert, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I applied and got it. So that messed up all my plans of I should have a sabbatical and write for 6 months. And God said, no, you're going to do this. So what I'm now doing is working for the Oxford Diocese, part-time disability advisor for the whole diocese, 3 counties. Only a small job, and then part-time lead chaplain amongst deaf people, which is a fabulous role controversial because I'm hearing the minimal BSL, British Sign Language, but of course the priestly nature of chaplaincy is what I'm drawn to, and deaf people being very much on the margins of mainstream in every aspect of life, and that ambassadorial role, that advocacy role that I find in both of my parts of my post, but particularly for deaf people who can articulate it as a community more than the disabled people can. So that's what I do at the moment.
Brilliant. So you said a little bit about when you began to get involved with Church Online, but when was that exactly? How long and how did it come about? Because obviously the online sphere has, you know, over the last 10-20 years, it's just sort of exploded, as it were. So when did that happen for you?
I think Twitter reminds me I've been on there for about 10 years. So I've been on Twitter for about 10 years, but actively not so much. It has picked up in the last 5. I've been on Facebook for longer. And again, in the early days, you think, oh, I'll keep that link. I'll come back to that next week. And of course, Facebook links last about a day at the speed it all goes at now. So it's been interesting watching the pace of things and the disposability of any kind of post. You know, Twitter, you have to post every 20 minutes for it to get noticed. The same thing over and over again for it to get picked up on. Facebook, it sits there a bit longer, but the transient nature of both has been a big learning curve, never mind trying to be church and have relationships in those two spaces. So I think my intentionality about being more of a priestly presence probably came about 5 years ago. I'm co-founder of Disability and Jesus. On Twitter it's @DisabilityJ. We have a website too, but most of our traffic happens on Twitter. We've got 15,500 followers over the last 5 years. I've no idea how, it's just snowballed, which is great. And Disability and Jesus is a user-led task group of 3 disabled Christians, 2 priests, 1 lay, who came together originally to write a book and rail against the system. And then we realised that no one actually reads books, they just get put in bibliographies and gather dust. So we thought we'd be more useful by being proactive as a task group in our spare time and being out there talking to people wherever we found them.
Yeah.
We tried talking to churches about disability, theology and access, and churches were willing to have us as guests and less able to put into practice what they agreed they'd learned through lots of different reasons and restrictions and what have you. So there was an ongoing relationship by visiting church buildings, doing audits, going to PCC meetings and deanery synods and garson synods we can be invited to, going to workshops and seminars by things like New Wine Spring Harvest, but locally rather than nationally. We weren't known enough to go nationally and therefore trusted and respected enough as Disability and Jesus. And we kind of looked around and went, this is fine, but where is everybody? We're talking to the in crowd. Where's everybody on the outside? And we already knew from our activism side of things, engaging with disability activists, that pretty much everybody who felt marginalised and had a voice, or felt marginalised and found a community, were on Twitter. Now, there are other platforms, but the biggest group of people who have been excluded or felt excluded from the mainstream church were on Twitter. And the non-church activists were on Twitter. And if you wanted to engage with a decent conversation about what it meant to be disabled and marginalised and excluded, or felt like you had been, whether reality matched that or not, that's where we had to be. And we had to go on there, introduce ourselves, and then listen and pay attention to the people who were already on that margin place. We were the newcomers at that point, to listen to iChurch and St. Pixels from their experience, because we're building on their shoulders, if you like. And then to say, in the light of what we've heard and experienced and learnt and paid attention to, how are we going to set up our tent in this exodus space, be part of this pilgrim community who are on the edge, find our own voice and contribute something really important. And what we discovered was relationships are key to the online space. That's been the biggest learning curve.
Brilliant. And so when you started to engage with it, was it, I mean, what does church look like online for you? What does that look like? How's it evolved over the time? And then, and did it feel like church straight away?
Yeah.
Or how much time did it take for you to feel like you could name it as church? And were there particular kind of building blocks or, you know, links that meant that, oh, I can now call this church rather than just some sort of more nebulous grouping?
Sure. I mean, we did as Disability in Jesus, and then me as an individual priest thinking, how do I engage with people with a dog collar on the online space, separate to, but you know, complementary to Disability in Jesus' work. We did look at different models that already existed, like St. Pixels, like Ship of Fools, like iChurch, which are primarily web page based.
Yeah.
You go to a web page and then you go to different rooms from there, and it's quite 2D in that a screen is 2D. This is what the Deaf Church are finding in terms of having to try and do WhatsApp conversations using sign language. Sign language is very much a 3D whole body movement experience, and on screen it becomes flat and 2D. So if you take that as an analogy, trying to reproduce a church building setting and environment and experience and just put it onto a camera, which I think a lot of church online is trying to do, is trying to be the church, which is over there, but put it in here with a camera and assume or hope it'll do the same. Because if I as a priest know what I'm doing in a church building and I just transpose that into my kitchen with a webcam, then surely it works. And of course, a camera makes everything very 2D. And so church online is really difficult because you're transposing a 3D space onto a 2D platform. And actually what we learned was, if you're going to do that kind of thing, if you're just going to basically stream what you would usually do, then you're perpetuating the idea of presenter and viewer, and the kind of almost the voyeuristic being watched version of church, which doesn't necessarily feel very engaging. You know, you watch the news, but you don't engage with Hugh Edwards. So that's why I think people felt disquieted or dissatisfied initially with what the church was trying to do in the online space. It was trying to transpose church to online, and then kind of realizing that the lack of engagement and the lack of conversation and the lack of relationship was really problematic. And rather than say, well, in that case, what can we do to change it? There was just critique and saying, well, this isn't right, and therefore we can't do it. Disability in Jesus, we looked at things like St. Pixels and Ship of Fools and iChurch and said, we don't think we've got the wherewithal and the resources to create a multi-platform website that can do the kind of avatar-based recreation of a offline space. What we decided to do was go with conversations. So we would start, a bit like being a vicar in a coffee shop, wearing a dog collar with a Bible and a bit of paper next to you, and inviting people to come and join in and say, so what are you doing, vicar? Are you really a priest? Or are you a priestess or a lady vicar? Thank you for asking. Bring a cup of coffee and have a chat. We did that online. So we would instigate conversations on disability in Jesus that we knew were a little bit edgy. We would retweet activists who were critiquing the church. We would put opinions out there and say, what do you think? And we were kind of create a coffee shop environment where we invited the conversation or joined in. And it kind of just blossomed. Lots of people saying, I'm so glad you're saying this because I've been asking this for years. And it just generated conversations that then became relationships, that then became regular followers, that then became people drawn in. Like I say, it just snowballed to 15,000 followers, quite a lot of whom are active. And it became a safe space to disagree about God, activism, what disability even meant, what inclusion really meant, what accessibility meant, what belonging meant. That was a big one. And from there, people said to us, well, seeing as you're Christians, can you kind of do prayers now and again? Yeah, we can do that. And people began to ask for things they were missing from church buildings because they couldn't get into them, but they really missed from church community. So Disability in Jesus, we started doing prayer threads. For the high seasons and holy days, we did sort of a harvest festival where we did a thread comments about different aspects of teaching and pictures of harvests and what it might mean to be fruitful. We tried, and that was okay, but if you miss a bit of the thread and came in on a random comment, you could end up throwing the entire discussion sideways, which, you know, which is fun. Like being heckled in a sermon and thinking, where did I go on? You know, which none of us like being heckled in sermons, but it's like, and we still do some of that, but then people say, well, how about actual formal prayer? If we're a community, why are we not a community of prayer? So Dave Lucas began writing, using the idea of the office, so the morning, midday, afternoon, evening, complement and nocturne that you might get in a monastic community. He began writing prayers with a disability, accessibility, welcome and inclusion and belonging slant, that he then turned into the ordinary office. Ordinary because it's for ordinary people, and office to pick up the idea of the community idea of regular prayer through the day. And we've got something like, you know, 1 million hits over the last 4 years on the ordinary office website, and we post up at morning, midday, afternoon, evening, compline and nocturne on the Twitter feed, so people can say, oh yes, I remember to go and pray, and they can connect through and what have you. He's developed that into Prayers for Lockdown as well, which is a different website again, where people can just come and pray through these words, and they're a bit like Psalm 13, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever, kind of prayers. But also using widget symbols alongside the English, and trying to connect in YouTube videos that we think really kind of visually address what we're trying to do with the English and the widgets. So we also pre-record as live, but pre-recorded, a Sunday service, which is 30 minutes long, if that's, different people doing different bits, so collaboration and participation. So just trying to answer the question of how can we be community, how can we bring Jesus into this with lots of different ways, all of which use online rather than offline spaces.
And so I was interested in what you were saying about the, you know, maybe initially in lockdown, so thinking about, you know, those who've been online, you know, for a longer period, and then those perhaps who lockdown was their first foray into it, and the whole idea that of that 3D space being sort of somehow trying to be imposed on the 2D sort of space. And just wondering about what you feel about the sort of the conversation about wanting to get back into churches, and do you think that maybe there was something about a discomfort with imposing what was that 3D space in church into this space, whether it's your study or your kitchen or whatever, and so that rather than sitting with that discomfort and thinking, well, how do we do the online thing, you know, well, so that it actually is church, it might have to look a bit different to how we do it in the building. The sort of comfort of getting back into the building might have been something about that. I'm not saying it was entirely about that, and you know, that in a way that conversation has come and gone, and I wish we could have stayed with that a bit longer personally, because I think some of these conversations are really fruitful and can make for the flourishing of the church in a different way. But you know, I'm glad that people have been able to stream back in church. But I am interested that if we had stayed a bit longer, we could have, maybe it's something about that, the difference between the 3D and 2D space, no less being real, but having to do it in a different way.
And I have to say, as a former incumbent, I am quietly relieved and a tiny bit smug that I'm not currently an incumbent, because I don't have the dreadful pull on me from 9 different directions that I see my incumbent clergy colleagues having. Even if they're very clear about what they think about offline and online and the benefits or the challenges of each, they are still being pulled in 9 different directions, up, down and sideways, in this whole conversation about the value and the place of the physical space and the reopening and the risks and the transmission rates and all that kind of collusion stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I'm not in the middle of all that, and I have complete empathy for everybody who is, which is why I can't have a hard line yes, no on this question of the value of each, because I think there's nothing really black and white in life anyway. You know, the fall, if you go with the poetry of Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, it was very black and white. That one, don't touch. Everything else, all yours. you know, it was, and even we got that wrong. So we've been living with this grey area, this grey thing in life ever since, generations and generations. But it's not quite as simple as online good, offline bad, you know, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. It's not that simple. It's way more nuanced. And the whole thing about human error and risk is all part of the conversation. What I think I'm more interested in is some of the concepts behind the outworking of the angst. And it is fascinating to watch when offline, I'm talking about physical church buildings as the offline church, came online because they had to. There was literally no way of being the offline church for some time. And the only space available was online. And everyone had to learn how to use webcams and how to have their camera not up their noses or down their chests, but, you know, kind of on the eye level, and how clutter behind you was unhelpful, all those etiquette things, and how to unmute themselves in Zoom meetings without going, where's the unmute? I can't sit. What do you mean top left? Which is your top left and my top right? And all that stuff, which is still hilarious. When they had to learn a different way of being, I really felt sorry for most clergy, because we're not trained to use cameras. We have that appalling thing when we're doing preaching practice in our training, where you have to be filmed doing a preach in a church building, and we all sit there going, do I have to? And maybe we should have tried harder at that point. But that was more about improving our preaching than it was about our presence. So there was this moment where everything we'd been trained to do, in the space we'd been trained to do, it was taken away. And we were having to learn, I say we, I don't mean me because I was already online, but we as a collegiate whole were having to learn this new process of engagement. And like I say, we just picked up what we thought we knew and dumped it somewhere else and thought it would work. And the whole language of exile, where we'd have been forced out of our land. Well, actually in the exile, only the elite were forced out, to be fair. Everybody else got left behind. And in the Exodus, they had to leave behind what they knew, a systemic way of being, yes, slavery, and discover this new land to travel through, not to get back to slavery, but to discover the lessons learned in their own land that they never occupied before. And this idea of the new normal, which is also a misnomer, because we'll go back to what we did because we're creatures of habit. So it was a very frustrating time, I think. And there is something about not wanting to pit one against the other.
Yeah.
Offline has the beautiful advantage of being in the same physical space together. And we are built to be physical bodies. Jesus wasn't a concept at the incarnation. He was born as a human being and lived and ate and worked and sweated and cried and grieved and laughed and drank wine and ate meat and vegetables and non-dairy for all the vegans. You know, he did all the human embodied stuff because he was a human body. So there's something massively important and precious and beautiful about being embodied. There's also something about, if that is important, then why the heck are our offline spaces not good enough for everybody to be part of? And I think some of the difficulty that the online community have found is this, what I call hand-wringing angst. When offline joined online, oops, that's the microwave, sorry. When online joined offline joined online, and everyone said, this space is really hard. What about those who haven't got internet access? What about those who can't hear Zoom properly? What about those who can't ring in? What about those who have web poverty? What about those who can't see the screen? What about those who can't get here and do this? And what about those who we've lost by coming here? And the online community said, yes, those are excellent questions. We have been asking the same questions about offline church for years. And you said to us, well, I'm sorry you can't get in. I'm sorry your guide dog doesn't fit under the pew. I'm sorry you can't hear the sermon. We haven't got a tea or we have, but no one has to turn it on again. I'm sorry that you can't access the words of the service. It's BCP, which we love it, but it's not big enough print for you. I'm sorry about that. And all we got was, I'm sorry you can't do that. What a shame. Maybe you could find a different church where they can cater for you and you can be ministered to. And there was that real difficulty of the narrative of offline church is brilliant and gets it right. Online is the crumbs under the table. And thank God we can get back to our offline space where church is done properly.
Yeah.
And all the online is going, you never afforded us that same permission to critique. You never afforded us that same permission to challenge. You just fobbed us off with, well, we're okay. And that's the biggest problem I found with the online-offline relationship, is that if we now ask the same question to the offline church and go, now you're back, when do we get to join in? And offline will go, well, that would be a DAC matter. That would be a funding issue. That would be an access. We've had an audit and we're doing okay. The people who can be here are here. And that's where the online-offline conversation needs to be really honest and to say it's not that one's better than the other, but one has had the elite privilege of place for so long, it doesn't listen to the questions and critiques and fobs it off as a financial issue.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. There's a lot of challenge in that, a lot of challenge to take forward. I guess I'm thinking that I'm not sure. So you're saying it's not that online offline one is better than the other. Some of the rhetoric has been that one is better than the other. So, but I'm guessing that for me, there's a question around those for whom online church is going to be the sort of the main church for them, if not the only church for them, for whatever reasons, whether it's to do with global pandemic lockdown, or whether it's to do with accessibility issues, or whether it's to do with not necessarily accessibility issues around the building or the worship not being able to include, but for whatever reason the person themselves isn't able to access, you know, whether it's neurotypical stuff or mental health issues or that kind of thing. The building isn't accessible. So for those for whom online church is their church, what about stuff around, so you talked about relationship being the really important thing. So I'm interested in stuff around touch, that physical kind of bodiliness, and how that relates to online church. But also the knotty conversation around receiving communion and what communion can and does look like for the online church, the theological and, you know, sort of kind of feeling stuff, actually, the emotional stuff around receiving communion. So online church and touch and communion, what do you think about?
So the importance and the relevance of touch is only life-giving if touch is life-giving, and not everybody finds touch an affirming thing. So it's always interesting to hear one of the arguments for we must get back offline again because people are missing human touch. Is generally true, but not universally true. For many people who have been the victims of abuse and survivors of abuse, touch is an absolute don't do it, because you will never do it in a way that is completely safe for them. So things like the peace, which a lot of people have a snippy thing about the peace anyway, is an imposed system of touch. And so for folks for whom touch is a complete stumbling block, online is so much safer. You can share the piece with sign language. You can send each other, you know, emoticons and gifts of hugs without there being that physical trigger and emotional trigger. So touch is only important for those for whom touch is a safe thing. And you can have that caveat with everybody. Oh yes, generally speaking, we're embodied and therefore touch is really important. However, not for everybody, which is why offline is great for those for whom the human body is a safe space, and online is better for those for whom the human body is not a safe space. And then the tricky issue, I think, this is why you kind of need both. You need both to be in relationship and in conversation with each other, and where one cannot, the other one can, and they pass the baton to each other and say, look, we're not able to do this, can you? And the offline says, yes, we can. And the same for the online. So there has to be that ongoing relationship between the two. We don't snub monastic communities and say, well, we shouldn't, and say, oh, you're so out of touch. We say, actually, you bring something very different to the busy diary of the evangelical preacher. And the busy diary of the evangelical preacher is something very different to the quiet monastic life. And together they complement and make the body of Christ. So I think those kind of arguments are easy to go, yes, but however, one can complement the other where the other one fails and doesn't manage to do it. So let's not snub either for being less than what the other perceives it to be. Communion is a much, well, from my point of view, it's not difficult at all. But then I've got a very low theology. That's a bit patronising, isn't it? A different theology from some of my folks who call it mass rather than communion. And the difficulty with this is it kind of comes down to a theology of whether Jesus is theologically present in bread and wine or physically present in bread and wine. If Jesus is physically present in bread and wine, the words of institution by the priest, then only the priest can do this because they are commissioned and ordained to do this in a history of consecration and what have you. And can only be done in the presence of other people, otherwise the physicality doesn't really make sense. And so can Jesus be physically present if there's no priest and if there's no gathering of people in a physical embodied sense? Then not really, not along that theological line. So if Jesus is physically present and I'm doing it here in my kitchen as a priest, and you're doing it, somebody else is doing it in their living room with their own version of bread and wine, Jesus is not physically present in their space because he's physically present in my space, and he's not in two places at once. The physical presence is in one place, and Jesus as a physical body is confined to time and space as we are. So if Jesus is theologically present, then it's about the relationship, however that's formed, and the words being observed. I don't use the word heard because deaf people don't hear the words of institution, they observe them. So the words of institution are enacted, they are observed by the gathered congregation wherever they find themselves, and together Jesus is theologically present wherever those words are participated in. So I can say them as a priest at home down a webcam, knowing that people out there are watching from the other direction. There's that relationship of the two. I enact the words of institution. Jesus is theologically present in their homes and in my home as we together have that moment of communication and communion. And therefore communion is a viable thing in that moment. In the same way that when I was in an offline church building at 8 o'clock communion, doing the BCB words of institution, and kept some of it back, also blessed in that moment, and took it to people's homes afterwards. They hadn't heard the institution words, they weren't present when they were being said. I didn't say them again because that's a kind of confusing theological double blessing thing going on there, which we're not supposed to do. But I said to them, these have been blessed, these have been consecrated, they are the theological presence of Jesus, the body of Christ, the blood of Christ. And I think that's our kind of model of they are being, Jesus is theologically present, and there may be a time lapse or a space lapse, but Jesus can overcome that because he's no longer fully embodied, he is now both embodied and heaven. So from my point of view, if I chose to, I could celebrate communion here, being watched by people there, they have bread and wine, I have bread and wine, Jesus is present in that moment of reception and participating in the words. I haven't done it yet because my priestly outworking as a disability advisor doesn't necessarily include by default communion and sacraments. And my deaf chaplaincy, which does include communion and sacraments, it uses BSL in a very specific place and alongside a reader who is BSL. So I don't do all of it. We share together at the front of church. And my BSL as a solo priest is not good enough to give the communion what it deserves and give my deaf congregations the respect they deserve. And not all of them are online. So I haven't done communion down a camera. On a Sunday morning, my 9-year-old son does communion for us at home, and it's beautiful, and he leads it. and he does it brilliantly. And Jesus is theologically present in the bread and the apple juice.
So you haven't necessarily had, or sort of, I don't know, had to do the, how does this outwork online, and what does this mean for my orders and my vocation?
Thankfully not. But also I haven't received communion from an ordained priest since the beginning of lockdown. And I haven't given anybody communion as an ordained priest since the beginning of lockdown. Am I missing out? Yes, but I can't quite find the words to tell you why. Just an innate sense of, I look forward to that moment when I can, but I'm not pushing for it. Am I receiving something immensely precious from my 9-year-old when he celebrates communion at our coffee table in our living room with his own version of common worship, which is pretty accurate, to be fair. He's heard enough of it over the years. Yes. And will I miss that when we go back to mainstream church expression? Hugely. He is a priest with a small p, and he's doing it brilliantly, and I love it to bits. So I haven't had anyone push me and say, can you not please do a BSL communion and send it out on video? If I had, I would say I would probably step behind the technicalities and go, I'm not good enough to do this as a BSL technician, although I am good enough to do it as a priest. And if I was pushed, I would find an interpreter and we would Zoom it together and we would send it out as live.
I mean, I think for me, the promises of God are to be present in those things that we call sacraments with a capital S. So for us, baptism and communion. And so the thing that I miss is knowing that in God's promises, God will be present to me in those things. So I haven't taken communion either since lockdown or offered it. But I know that in water and bread and wine and these things, God has promised to be present. So therefore, God will be present. But I also know that that does not mean that God is not present in a world which, has sacramental with a small s. In that sense, I cannot expect that of God, and I don't expect it of God in the communion or in baptism in a sort of magic spell type way. I do these things, AB plus.
That's Hogwarts. That's
God
church.
turns up. But because God, in God's mercy, is present in these things because of that promise. But actually, I have also found God to be present in other places in a way that correlates with that presence in communion, because that is God's prerogative to be present in wherever places God chooses to be present, in whomever God chooses to be present, and whichever material thing God chooses to be present. I guess the difference is that we know there is a promise there with communion. But for me, that's how I've been experiencing it, communion somehow, but what I would experience in communion in other ways. Because God is, present and desires to be present to God's people in those ways. Okay, so I think my last question now, Katie, thank you for everything that you've been saying. Obviously I came to this as, not as a disabled person, but as somebody who's been thinking about it because I've been shielding, I've been in lockdown. The online thing has, I have enjoyed online stuff before, but it hasn't been so much a part of my experience, perhaps as it has been for you. But I'm interested about how the online stuff links in terms of inclusivity, accessibility, disability, and is it just really about that? And the rest of us will, get back to normal. But also this idea of, well, should God always be accessible? Is, if God is absent to some group of people, just because that's the circumstances of life, should God then be absent to everybody else? Should we impose that on, everybody just because of this particular group of people? I'm so embarrassed asking this question, but I just thought it was you know, are disabled people being sort of selfish, expecting us all to engage with this in a particular way?
Sure.
Have at it, Katie.
I mean, disabled people make up 1 in 6 of the population, so that's quite a large minority of people to be not catering for. And that's a very colonial way of putting it, isn't it? The able-bodied church be catering for these people because they are 1 in 6 of our population, and that's quite significant. That rather assumes that only the able-bodied people are running the Church of England, which is a big, interesting thing to sweepingly generalise. There are more of us out there in the hierarchy, but they're not admitting to being one of us, the disabled. There's something, I'll go off a little rant in a second, but I won't off camera. There's something very distinctively different, though, about church and God. Thank goodness there is a difference. Although we should be maturing into being more like God with every generation, but we're still getting there, work in progress. So I cannot manipulate God's grace. I cannot, I mean, I might try, but that's Hogwarts, not church. I cannot manipulate God's mercy. I cannot manipulate, just conjure up God with some kind of amazing spell, because God is, was it Bart who said the other, as in completely rather than woo spooky. So WH, holy other. Even to talk about God is a waste of time because we simply don't have the human words to describe or define God. So why bother? Why bothering is like saying, how can I describe my love for my son? Well, I can't put it into words, but I know it's true, so I'll still try and talk about it because it's worth doing so. So when we be accessible to make it so in the same way that God is, we're kind of, it's a bit of a straw man argument because God is so different to church that you can't compare the two. It's like comparing Marmite and peanut butter. Marmite is evil, peanut butter is good. There is that dichotomy of going, just as God, so should the church. Just as the church, so should God. And I can't make God be anything to me that God does not choose to be. God is everywhere, but doesn't have to be. God is omnipresent, omnipowerful, omni-whatever, but also doesn't have to be. And if I say, well, God must be here with me now, and God's going, I'll be with you in a minute, but I'm doing other things, then I can't just demand his presence. You get the amazing parable that Jesus tells the widow and the judge, and Jesus says, be persistent, but not expectant. You know, God is not at your beck and call, but you do have the right to keep tapping on his door going, when's it my turn, when's it my turn, when's it my turn? So that relationship with God is about relationship and about God being the ultimate one who says yes or no, or hang on a second to us. Church buildings are a whole different kettle of fish because we have created these as a human construct. We didn't construct God, God constructed us. But we then constructed places where we said, and here is a place which is a good space, a godly space. And each church building will have its own nuances, you know, like people who love camping and people who love B&Bs, you know, you get to new wine. And it's a bit like that thing about, you know, true new winers will camp in a tent and not quite true new winers will bring a camper van because that's a bit cheating. And you know, not really trying hard new winers will be in a B&B in Harrogate just chipping in every day. And you're like, no, surely the relationship side of it makes it new wine, and however you come to it is the important bit. So church buildings are a human construct where we want to gather to enable worship, teaching, liturgy and sacraments to happen for the good of the congregations who come, so that they can go and do church and be church beyond the walls where we gather. And if the walls where we gather prevent people from being part of that community, how can they be resourced to be the church outside that place of gathering? If the liturgy is too quiet or too loud, the words are too small or too big, the screen's too flickering, the lights constantly buzzing, if the guide dog is turned away at the door because they're a pet, no, that's not legal. And if nobody with a disability is allowed to go through the vocations process because they might cost money for vocations, they're not worth it for the pension provision. They're not capable of doing vicaring how we've always done it over the generations. Well, good for you. You're a dying breed. Shove over and let us have a go. If we keep doing church we've always done it, we'll never have the whole body of Christ present to be resourced as the body of Christ, to worship as the body of Christ, and to go out there and be the body of Christ. We'll always be missing a limb here and there. and that's not the body of Christ. So church buildings as a construct where we contain or gather for what we do has to be a place where the whole church can gather, and if anyone's missing, that is not the body of Christ. So we must manipulate what we can to make it as good as it can be, whilst recognizing that God can choose to be absent or present, because that's God's choice. But if we're going to choose to make places, they have to be good.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katie. I'm going to draw our recorded conversation to a close now, but thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.